how much of the sedimentary rock record was actually deposited during Noah's flood. Well, hello and welcome back to part 3 of our 3-part series on the pre-flood flood boundary. In parts 1 and 2, we introduced scientific evidence that challenged the traditional creationist model that places the pre-flood flood boundary of Noah's flood at the Cambrian boundary or thereabouts in the geologic record. In this video, I will present a solution to that problem. First of all, I propose that the erosion associated with the great unconformity resulted not from the flood of Noah, but from the great regression of waters as it is recorded in Genesis 1. And God said, "Let the waters under the heavens be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear." And it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and the waters that were gathered together he called seas. And God saw that it was good. Answers in Genesis geologist Andrew Snelling says this about these early creation week processes. What is clear from the biblical record is that the perception of a human observer on the earth during creation week would have been that countless millions of years of earth history at uniformitarian rates had been compressed into 6 days of normal human experience. The reason then why we rarely find complex organisms fossilized in sediments below the great unconformity is because the fall had not occurred, the earth had not been cursed, and the deaths of complex organisms was still a yet to be realized nightmare. In other words, nothing had died yet. I propose that the continents containing thick sequences of stromatolites be interpreted much as they are in the secular scientific literature, as large, shallow water inland seas. Cambrian ecosystems then were not flood generated, but represent pre-flood environments where Cambrian specific marine life flourished. Other ecologies that we find in the sediments directly above the Cambrian most likely first flourished in the shallow oceans located offshore and were pushed into shallow water continental seas during post-fall but pre-flood tectonic activity. And this, of course, would require a plate tectonic regime that differed from that working in the present, where rates of plate movement were more rapid, perhaps working at meters of displacement per week, but not as rapid as those working during the flood, where many meters of ocean floor was subducted into the mantle in minutes. Andrew Snelling acknowledges that geologic processes operating today were different than those operating during the flood, which were different again from those operating in the pre-flood world. He says, thus we could expect that the features and strata of the pre-flood rock record are different from the rock record produced by the flood, with features even different from what is being produced by geologic processes operating today. It is even unclear whether uniformitarian rates of geologic processes, or even exactly the same geologic processes, were operating during the pre-flood period as those operating today. This all makes perfect sense in a non-uniformitarian, non-actualistic world. That the tempo of natural processes can drastically change is not just a creationist pipe dream. Many secular scientists are rethinking the slow and gradual of the 20th century. Consider Stephen Jay Gould's interesting observation about biological evolution. He says this: under punctuated equilibrium, species originate at points of birth with initial fuzziness confined to an insignificant moment. And he thinks that's thousands to tens of thousands of geologic years. Properly scaled against later existence in stasis, which just means they don't change much, over, he thinks, millions to tens of millions of years. Essentially, Gould is saying that rates of evolutionary change should not be shackled to old school uniformitarian thinking, but should be viewed in terms of massive jumps followed by virtual snail trails. What's interesting about Gould's assertion is that this biological phenomenon is just a theory. Although it incorporates several possible mechanisms, it still lacks scientifically persuasive results. Okay, so let's apply my theory to North America as an example. According to secular scientists, the North American craton or continent was dominated by a vast inland sea in Cambrian time. During Middle Ordovician time, small volcanic islands known as island arcs began to accrete onto the then southeast side of that craton. As these arcs pushed against the continent, mountains began to form, the beginning of what we call the Appalachians. Now, due to forces pushing the ground up, other forces began to push the ground down on the western side of the Appalachians. This depression is known as a foreland basin. As the mountains rose up, sand, shale, and mud from the growing mountains were deposited in the foreland basin as turbidites. All these sediments eventually filled the basin, leaving a thick wedge of land-based sediments over much of present-day eastern North America. Now, this would also explain the relative sequence of trilobite zones across many parts of the US. In an evolutionary scenario, these zones represent cycles of evolution and extinction, but in my model, they simply represent trilobite migration. Now, creationists must disregard the time over which these events are believed to have occurred by secular scientists, but there is no need to disregard the sequence. Given a non-uniformitarian plate tectonic regime, all of these sediments could have been deposited very rapidly in centuries or decades. This means, of course, that many parts of the fossil record were not actually generated by the flood, but were deposited in catastrophic regional flooding events that only culminated in a universal global climax that we call the flood. This regional destruction continued even after the flood proper. Most creationists believe that the world in the first 200 years after the flood would have been a very dangerous place to live. Massive volcanic explosions, huge earthquakes, and powerful tsunamis would have continued to batter continents for hundreds of years as the Earth's internal geologic system sought to reach equilibrium. This activity would, of course, have killed millions of animals. Even Morris and Whitcomb, in their seminal book, The Genesis Flood, believed that millions of mammals died just in the Ice Age alone. This ramping down in geologic activity is really no different than the ramping up that I propose occurred in the pre-flood world. Given a world where large, shallow water inland seas dominated the world's continents, I propose that the flood proper, as recorded in Genesis 6 through 9, would have been less destructive than most creationists have proposed. This is because many land masses were already inundated with large bodies of water. Only exposed land masses would feel the full brunt of catastrophic flooding from the flood event itself. I propose then that creationists should be looking for a divide in the rock record that separates marine deposits, such as limestones, from regional scale land-based sedimentary sandstones and conglomerates. Now, speaking very generally, such a divide seems to occur starting in Carboniferous through Permian rocks and continues through the Mesozoic. Cenozoic deposits are also more land-based, it's true, but their geographical extent is limited to local distributions. Consider the Mesozoic Morrison Formation with the Cenozoic Green River Formation. In my model, the Mesozoic sediments probably represent the events recorded in Genesis 6 through 9 that we tend to call the flood. But as I said earlier, this scientific model should only be imposed very loosely on the theological reality. So what does all of this mean? Well, if this model is correct, then it means popular creationism needs to stop using certain kinds of geologic evidence as a sort of proof text for Noah's flood. For example, if many continental surfaces were covered with shallow oceans in the pre-flood world, then we should expect to find marine fossils on those continents. And there is also the flood interpretation that many young Earth creationists typically associate with fossils in general. If it was very rapidly, then the flood did it. Yet many young Earth creationists believe that the entire Cenozoic and all of the rapidly buried animals contained in those sediments were killed and buried many hundreds of years after the flood. Finally, erosion associated with the Great Unconformity could have occurred during Creation Week. This means that creationists should be very cautious about using this particular geologic feature as evidence in support of Noah's flood. So, Lots to think about. Of course, I've only scratched the surface in this video series. For a detailed understanding of this model, then please read my 26,000 word paper titled Using Stromatolites to Rethink the Precambrian-Cambrian Pre-Flood Boundary, which can be found in the current edition of the Answers Research Journal. So for more resources, you can also go to my website, www.creationunfolding.com. You can also read my book, and please go ahead and subscribe. Hit that button right now for faster access to more of these kinds of videos in the future as they're published. Thank you and goodbye.